Уважаеми колеги, докато ни плашат с някакви севернокорейски войници, които никой не е виждал, шефовете на Европейския съюз, а и някои от вас са слепи за най-голямата опасност – опасността от Трета световна война. Днес такава война изглежда съвсем реална, защото Демократическата партия на Съединените щати и нейните европейски васали позволиха на властите в Киев да използват далекобойни ракети срещу Русия. И не, това няма да помогне на Украйна. Ако политиката на наливане на бензин в огъня на войната продължи, това само ще накара Русия да отговори по такъв начин, че ударът с свръхзвуковата ракета Орешник ще изглежда като гръмване на детски фойерверк. Разбирам, че отиващата си администрация във Вашингтон е бясна заради загубените президентски избори и че прави всичко възможно, за да не позволи постигането на мир в Украйна. Не разбирам обаче защо лидерите на Европейския съюз препускат като конника без глава към пропастта. Тези хора не осъзнават, че всичките им действия, включително и даването на далекобойни ракети на Зеленски, не просто удължават войната в Украйна, а ни изправят пред ядрен апокалипсис. За съжаление, Европа днес се управлява от бесове, които несъмнено ще я погубят.
Weekly battles have increased from 900 to over 1,000, with Russia capturing nearly 100 square kilometers, primarily in the Kupyansk, Kurakhove, and Pokrovsk areas, as its operations intensify along the southern front. This unquestionably amounts to the fastest advance of the Russian army since the end of 2022. In the short to medium term, the Ukrainian army analyst Sergei Gurets said that Russia aims to reach the borders of Donetsk Oblast and says that all operations are potential precursors to an offensive on Kupyansk and Kramatorsk, which he said are critical defense hubs for us. The offensive toward Velyka Novosilka, which is the hottest topic of this past week, creates prerequisites for Russian advances in the southern direction, making the issue of Zaporizhia increasingly relevant. However, it is necessary to consider both parties' forces. He said that at present, all reserves that Russia is forming as rapid reinforcements are being used to compensate for losses along the entire front line. In opposition, Ukraine suffers from insufficient reserves to properly defend each attack. He also noted that the majority of Russian forces are now concentrated in the Pokrovsk and Kurakhove sectors, with approximately 50,000 to 10,000 personnel gathered at various positions. Another Ukrainian official, a UAV crew commander to be precise, had a slightly different opinion. He said that the Russian forces are planning to move forward and perhaps go beyond the Donbas. In an interview with Ukrainian TV, he said as follows: "The Russians are relentlessly storming our positions. It is clear that they are not limiting themselves to the Donetsk region or the Donbas. They aim to push forward. I used to think their ambitions were confined to the regions they claim as part of Russia under their so-called constitution. Now I am convinced they're aiming for more." These were the words of Andriy Oshinash. This commander's words, if true, raise the question of how soon this war can end. If he is correct, and Russia does show an intention to move beyond the borders of the Donbas, then it seems to me that there is no possibility of peace talks upon President-elect Donald Trump's inauguration in January next year. For it means that after Velyka Novosilka falls, along with Kurakhove, the next major battles will be Pokrovsk, followed by the last defensive line in Donetsk, which comprises the beltway containing 4 cities from Konstantinivka and Druzhivka to Kramatorsk and Slovyansk. Even at the current pace of the Russian advance, that could take months to accomplish. However, at the same time, it must be noted that once those last defensive lines fall, there are no considerable defenses behind which that can stop the Russians. In other words, once Donetsk falls, Russia will have a relatively free run all the way to Kiev, and thus we can truly see that sudden collapse thereafter. But all of this for now amounts to mere interesting speculation. What we do know is what is going on the front line in the areas of Velyka Novosilka, Kurakhove, Pokrovsk, Kupyansk, and Kursk, which are all areas that will be covered today. And what we will see is that Ukraine is buckling under the widespread Russian offensive, and gaps are appearing all over, allowing for multiple Russian breakthroughs. And thus, the result is the most rapid territorial gains for Russia since they took the land bridge in 2022. So let's get into it. The situation near Velyka, Novosilka, one of Ukraine's largest fortifications on the southern front, has significantly worsened. While Ukrainian forces have managed to hold the invading Russian troops at their previous positions on the western and southern flanks, there has been a setback on the eastern front. Advancing along the road from Zolotaya, Niva, Russian forces managed to cover more than 10 kilometers in just 5 days, with almost no resistance approaching the outskirts of Velyka, Novosilka. This occurred despite the fact that their route passed along a ridge between the Kashalakh and Shaitanka rivers, which could have been easily targeted. However, it seems that the Ukrainian defense forces lacked the means or opportunity to stop them. A similar situation unfolded on the road from Shakhtarsk, where Russian forces also advanced more than 10 kilometers and reached Ukrainian fortifications. Meanwhile, advanced Russian units have already attempted to enter the settlement. It is likely that a strong defense will be organized within Velyka Novosilka itself. However, to weaken its resistance, Russian troops are attempting to bypass the settlement from the north. They have already captured half of Rozdolny and are likely to continue moving toward Velyka Novosilka Kurakhove road. This would significantly complicate logistics to the settlement and undermine its defensive capabilities. As Russian forces advance from the east, they have also intensified their actions from the south. Here, their goal is not only to quickly recapture the territory that the Ukrainian armed forces liberated during last year's counteroffensive, but also to create conditions for a further offensive in the Zaporizhia region, particularly around the neighboring front of Mariupol. The situation both to the north and south of Kurakhove has been increasingly threatening for the city's defense since the beginning of October. However, over the past 2 months, the Ukrainian defense forces have managed to hold the Russians back, engaging in defensive and rearguard battles and buying time for their country, often at the cost of their own lives. Currently, in some areas of the front, the situation is so dire that the Ukrainian armed forces are prioritizing a safe retreat over defense. In particular, on the southern flank, Russian troops have advanced 5 kilometers from Romanivka, cutting off Ukrainian forces defending Antonivka, Ilinka, and Yelizavetica. Stabilizing the front here seems unlikely, as on the opposite side, the occupiers are assaulting Trudove and Ospenivka, aiming to collapse the line further by 35 to 40 square kilometers. For now, the military is managing to halt the Russians long enough to allow a relatively safe retreat for the forces trapped in a semi-encirclement. Ospenivka and Constantinople are expected to become key strongholds in the near future, holding off the Russian invaders while a new defensive line is being constructed somewhere west of Kurakhove. Meanwhile, within the city itself, the Russians have taken control of its eastern part. The assault groups are crossing the ravine and attempting to break through to the central part of Kurakhove to establish positions in the high-rise buildings. The Ukrainian defense forces are currently eliminating all those attempting to reach the center, or so they claim. However, the Russians' numbers are soon expected to become overwhelming, and the Ukrainian army will likely be forced to retreat. According to the Commander-in-Chief, General Syrsky, Russian forces outnumber Ukrainian troops in the section of the front by a ratio of a whopping 5 to 1. For the same reasons, it has not been possible to halt the Russians near Dachi, where the advance threatens both the southern outskirts of Kurakhove and the defenders in the Uspanivka area. On the northern flank, the Russians have completely occupied Beretsky and made a several-kilometer breakthrough southward from Voznesenka. In Sonstivka, Ukrainian defenders held off the Russians for weeks and even attempted counteroffensives. The defense line now runs along the Soluna River. From Beretsky, the Ukrainian armed forces are retreating toward Stary Turny, where they aim to slow the occupiers' long turn between the Soluna and Vovcha rivers. The duration of the defensive battles here will determine how long Kurakhove can continue to hold. In any case, the Russians have failed to capture the city quickly, and its defense is expected to continue into December.
Идет, нормально. Химик, на! Попали.
The Pokrovsk front has become increasingly active, with over 300 attacks in the last 7 days, surpassing previous records. While the northern flank remains moderately active, with no significant territorial changes, the Russians are focusing their efforts on encircling the city from the south, forming what is known as a strike pincer. Key targets in this maneuver are the villages of Novosilka and Shevchenkove, which would allow the Russians to begin bypassing the city from the south. However, this prospect is not imminent. For now, Russian troops have advanced 2 kilometers along the Soluna River toward the village of Zvote, where fighting is currently ongoing. They have also expanded their control around the already occupied Urivka, gradually advancing westward along a 10-kilometer front. Despite their efforts, progress remains relatively slow. The Ukrainian armed forces are actively working to stabilize the front, engaging in fierce battles for every stronghold.
Ложись! Молодцы! Все! Забери! Выстрел!
The Russians continue to tighten their grip on the Ukrainian foothold east of Borova. Notably, they have seized several square kilometers of territory between Stelmakivka and Lozova, pushing beyond the Luhansk region. They are also attempting to bypass Lozova from the south. Additionally, the Russians have made progress southward in Krylyakivka. One of the most contested areas has been Pervomayevsky, which the Russians have captured a few weeks ago. However, while they attempted to advance south toward Kupyansk, the Ukrainian Defense Forces repelled all assaults and managed to push them back. On the northern front, in the Kupyansk area, there have been no changes in the front line, and the Ukrainian armed forces have successfully completed the clearance of Kupyansk, where Russian paratroopers had broken through last week. A surprising development for Ukrainian defenders has been the Russian crossing of the Oskil River to the north of Kupyansk, where the front line had remained stable since 2022. In the area between Novominsk and Borichny, the Russians managed to penetrate Ukrainian positions and are now attempting to secure and advance toward Novominsk. Fighting in the area continues. Despite Russian forces applying tremendous pressure on the Kursk region, they have achieved little success. On the contrary, all their attacks are being successfully defended by Ukrainian defenses. The Ukrainian forces have managed to stabilize the front line, even though this was not initially planned, as they had been engaging in operations to expand the gray zones. However, after the Russians gathered a force of 50,000 and launched their offensive, the defense forces were compelled to retreat from these gray zones, consolidating the front line into a 100-kilometer stretch. In this sector, the Russian troop density is 500 soldiers per square kilometer, comparable to the concentration observed in the Kurakhove direction, where, according to the Ukrainian General Staff, Russian forces outnumber Ukrainian ones 5-1. Unlike the Kurakhove front, however, the Ukraine armed forces in Kursk are acting in a highly coordinated manner, successfully repelling Russia's advances. A notable example is the stalling of the Russian offensive near Blahovo. where the Russian forces were lured into a fire trap. The ongoing fighting in Kursk region and the setbacks near Kurakhove for the Ukrainian armed forces have once again underscored the urgent need for reforms within the Ukrainian forces and the transition to a core-based structure for the defense forces, writes a Ukrainian analyst. Meanwhile, 6 Ukrainian Storm Shadow missiles struck deep into Russian territory, hitting significant targets in Marino, where a Russian command post overseeing operations in Kursk was located. Reportedly, some officers were killed. Following the first salvo, a second strike targeted the Kursk airfield, destroying some local air defense systems.
Пиздец, ебать, там хуярит, блядь! Ебать! Твою мать, блядь! Пизда нахуй!